Welcome. Nice to see you all. I don't know that I've seen all of you before, but many of you, so it's feeling more and more familiar. I'm glad that you're here for this presentation. This will be a three-person presentation, and so Provost Hecker and Claire Strickland and I, Claire, the Chief Business Officer, we will alternate in speaking to you. And I understand that this is a long-standing tradition, and so this is not the first time you've all seen one of these presentations. However, it is my first time in being a part of one, and more significantly, even being a part of this construction of the fiscal 2020 budget. So I'm very pleased to be able to be coming up to speed on how budget works here. And a reminder, anytime we're involved in the building of a budget, it's good to note that we should be driven by our values, by what we see as our vision. And you know that we're in the beginnings of a new strategic planning process that builds heavily on the blue sky process. And you can find out more about that if you take a look at, I believe it's at the President's website or on the Maine website to get more information about that. But as those of you who are following that will know, these are the three provisional strategic values that we've put forward. We feel that they encompass so much of what's in the Blue Sky Plan, and also they resonate well with what we know to be critically important here on the campus. And it's a reminder that budget should follow from the values that we hold crucial and important. And so fostering learner success, critical for us here on this campus, not only for our students, but for ourselves as the faculty and staff and professionals who are here at the university. We are learners too. Creating and innovating for Maine and beyond. This has underneath it, of course, an undercurrent of the research and the new knowledge and the scholarship that builds here at a university, and how crucial that all is to what we do, and making sure that our budget provides for that. And then finally, growing and stewarding partnerships. Maybe if you think of the old traditional engagement there, that fits a bit, but very sharply focused on the importance of leveraging through our partnerships all of the great things that happen here and that can be aligned with partners. So those three values are what we're working with thus far. I think they're good values for driving our budget thinking, and we'll come back to them later in the presentation. The second thing I'd like to say about those values is that the Board of Trustees has just released something that they're calling a draft declaration of strategic priorities. That too needs to drive budget because, of course, as you will see when Claire gets up to speak, the budget process is one that's fully engaged with the system and the trustees. But fortunately, what's in that document, I've shown some of the highlights in bullet points underneath our own strategic values. This is all very well aligned, and I think we'll be in good shape as we work with their document and our own efforts to continue to be a leader within the system along all of these lines. So just I'll mention a couple of things. They're very focused, as we are here, on making sure that the students who leave this university are well prepared to join the workforce, particularly the workforce in the state of Maine or wherever they might go, and to increase attainment, to increase college completion in the state, which is crucial to the economy of the state. You see the economic development theme. So these bullets are all from their draft document, which we will be posting probably tomorrow for the campus with a process for your input and reaction going forward. And then finally, this notion, you see it over to the right, of meeting the state needs. So all of this is in the background as we think about the budget. And with that, I'm going to now turn to Claire, who will do a first pass explanation of what we're up to.
So I just want to review with you that today we're focusing primarily on what we call the educational and general budget, what we fondly refer to as E&G. For those new in the audience, this is the primary budget at the university that funds our operational activities, including salaries and wages, operations, and everything else. But the component of revenue associated with that budget is primarily tuition and fee revenue, the state appropriation, sales and services, indirect cost recovery, and transfers from auxiliaries. The expense side is primarily made up of compensation, scholarships, and grants, and other expenses. Sometimes the system presents our budget, presents our E&G budget by putting scholarships and grants on the revenue side as an adjustment to tuition and revenue. We like to present it as an expense to the university. So scholarships and grants are shown on the expense side. So what does that mean as far as numbers are concerned? This was presented last May, and it was approved by the board of our $281.6 million educational and general E&G budget for this fiscal year. So FY19 was approved by the Board of Trustees at its May meeting in 2018. And it was balanced. Revenue associated with, you see all the revenue components and the percentages on this side. And if you recall, there's also an expense side that is balanced. So the year that we're in right now is FY 2019, and that's the jumping point from which we build our FY 20 budget. So anything that is shown from this point on is incremental to this budget. It's adjustments to this budget that we're currently in, the year that we're currently in. So what we're attempting to do here is place our campus budget process to build FY20 into the state of Maine's budget cycle. We have the same type of fiscal year. Our fiscal years start July 1 of a calendar year and ends in June of the following calendar year. In naming our fiscal years, we usually use the ending date of the calendar, of that calendar year. So it starts July 1, so FY19 is July 1, 2018 to June of 2019. That's fiscal year 19. We're building FY20, which will start July of 2019 and end in June of 20. So the state is in the same cycle as we are, and they're in a 2-year cycle. So their budget, let me just do this. Their budget process is already starting, and we are part of that process in that in September of this year, the Board of Trustees made a request to the state for additional funds for fiscal year 20. That request was made in September in Governor LePage's administration. By January of 2019, the current, the person who will be governor in January will have to present her budget, Janet Mills, will have to present her budget to the legislature, which will then, begin budget hearings, the process of budget hearings and work sessions and advocacy by the system, the University of Maine system. And hopefully by June of 2019, the legislature and the governor will finalize its state budget, within which is a state appropriation for all of our sister campuses. So this process is happening in September 2018 through June of 2019 for a biennial budget that starts July 1, 2019. So where do we fit in this budget process? How does our timeline fit into their timeline? This is a busy chart. It's a busy timeline, and some of you have seen it. I want to make sure we remember where we're at. This is where we are right now. We're right here, we're sitting, it's today. And everything that's happened before has led us to today. And during the course of the next several months, we will approach June, May and June of 2019, and hopefully we will have a balanced FY20 budget. So let me get you through this timeline. So in July and September, July through September of this past year, 2018, the year that we're in right now, July through September, we've had some initial conversations regarding the building of that budget, the building of the FY20 budget. What positions do we need? What initiatives do we have? We've had conversations with the cabinet. The provost has had conversations with the deans. Some directors have been brought in. We've looked at, financial aid needs. We've looked at most everything we can think of. By October, we were able to review in partnership with our UMS leadership. We were able to look at the allocations and assumptions that they had for their shared services budget. And we look at what they present, and in partnership we push back a little bit, and then there's a to and fro that happens to decide what their assumptions are and what we can move forward with as a shared allocation going into FY20. Also, in October, we have a better idea of where we are for enrollment. Fall census is in October, October 15th. We look at how we arrived at our credit hour mark on October 15th and make projections along with Deb Allen, our really good institutional research office, to figure out how those credit hours will move forward into the next academic year, into the next fiscal year. What will we have for retention? What will we have for a first-year class in the next year? And those assumptions are made. We review various tuition models and credit hour models and try to focus in on one. And that's the one we start using. And then we amend it a little bit later to see, how we can change that bottom line. But right now we're working on one particular enrollment model. And so we put everything together. We put, what the needs are for the campus, as far as positions, as far as initiatives, our revenue projections. Also what's going on here in the background, and you're not going to see it in this presentation, but departments on their own are asked to project their sales and services revenue. This isn't part of this budget presentation, but you all know that you're working on revenue assumptions in your sales and services area. So conferences and institutes is projecting what they might have for revenue in the next year. Some of the clinics might be working on what their projections are for sales and services that stay within that department. So, oops. I really screwed up. Okay, so here we are on November 26th, and after this meeting, within the next couple of weeks, we will have discussions related to building on a very micro level that budget. We'll be working with the VPs and the deans and directors to try to get a line item budget into PeopleSoft future financials so that by January 16th of 2019, we will be able to produce reports that tell us that we're balanced, hopefully, and what we've done to get to a balanced budget. We will then meet, we'll have a draft campus budget presented to the Board of Trustees Chair and the Finance, Facilities, and Technology Chair, and senior UMS leadership, so the President, the Provost, and myself will meet with that senior leadership at the system and present our draft budget as we've built it as of January 16, 2019. They'll give us some ideas as to yay or nay, or what they'd like us to do or emphasize. And we'll take that under consideration, and we still have time if some of our campus assumptions change. We have time here to change it until we meet with the full Finance and Facilities and Technology Committee in March. That's a public meeting. This meeting is not a public meeting. So here, an amended budget, an amended balanced budget is presented to the FFT. by all sister institutions, by all campuses of the University of Maine system. If we need to make changes, we still have some time from March to April. It's a very short time frame here. We can make final campus adjustments so that by the time we get to the May meeting of the Board of Trustees, they can approve a finalized budget for FY20. I need to caution, every 2 years we get to this stage. Remember I said the state is working on its state budget. We are assuming an appropriation increase in building our budget. We're not sure of that increase or any other adjustments, possibly additional adjustments that could be made to our A&G budget until they approve that budget in June. So it's very, we need to be careful as to how we're doing this.
Okay, so my task is to talk through a little bit about how we put together the budget, the process that we go through, and we'll start broad, very generally, and I'll work my way towards some real numbers for you. But this is, like any budget, right? If your household budget, you think, well, how much money are we going to have coming in, and how much are our expenses, and let's figure out how to calculate that. So we have the same thing here, right? At the university, we calculate various sources of revenue. Claire showed you what the revenue sources are. And then we have a whole set of expenses. But what's different is that we kind of break them down into fixed levers, we refer to them as, and flexible ones. So what do we mean by that? So the things that are fixed, basically that means we can't change it. So they are things like the rate of tuition. So are we going to change the tuition rate for our students? That's a Board of Trustees decision. We can't decide that on our own, so it's fixed for us. Now, it's not that we don't have any impact. The president can say a few things and be persuasive, but the final decision is theirs. Similarly with expenses, there are certain things that are in the expenses. Claire mentioned quickly are passing shared services. Our portion of shared services that we're billed by the system is determined with some archaic formula they have that is given to us. We're given a number. And you saw on the timeline, we've been given estimates of those numbers up to this point. Similarly, there are some things in the revenue side here that we can influence. I'll give examples of it. There are ways that we can change the revenue picture. And similarly, there are some things that we want to invest in. There are things that we don't have to make additional investments in, but we have the discretionary authority to do that, right? So things that we think of this as sort of the things that we want to be strategic, and make some strategic hires. They're going to change the budget from FY19 to FY20, and they go into these flexible expenses. So with that kind of broadly, let me kind of take you through each of those quadrants. So on the fixed length, as I said, what are the things that are fixed? The tuition and fee rate is fixed. So sometime this year, February or March, usually before that, in January, the Board of Trustees will determine the rate in which we were able to charge tuition. And so that goes into our calculations. As Claire pointed out, sometime during this coming year, the state is going to balance its budget, and it will make an appropriation to the University of Maine system, and we get our piece of that appropriation. Now, at this point in time, we have we've been told, for example, what we're requesting of the legislature in terms of appropriation increase. So we're modeling based on that. It's a conservative number, but it's a number that has gone forward. Similarly, we've been told what's going to be presented to the Board of Trustees in terms of a request for tuition rate change. In terms of fixed expenses, we have some other things again that we're modeling. So compensation, as you saw in the pie chart that Claire showed, that's our biggest expense. And we are collective bargaining campus. And so right now we're about to start collective bargaining processes with all the unions, and that will determine exactly what the increment or the change is in our compensation and benefits expenses. And once again, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but we're making a guesstimate of what that number will be. And then that goes into the formula. We say, well, if the unions settle out at this percentage, it'll have this impact on our expenses in 2020. And then, as I said, we have our operational increases, the shared services from our friends of the system. We have to do, changes in we make investments every year in our maintenance of facilities or utilities, all those things go up. We plan for that. So these are the sort of broad areas. It's not in detail, but the broad areas where we have incremental changes, as Claire explained. This is the change from over FY19 into FY20. So similarly, we're looking at our revenue and the things that, on the side where we're looking at what we can impact. And the big number is the tuition fees. Again, as you saw in the pie chart, tuition fees is actually the biggest part of our revenue. And so we've made some assumptions about the number of students that we'll take in next year, the number of students that will stay who are currently here, and we've based all that out on the retention we based on models over the last few years' performance. On the new enrollments, we've looked at the last few years, and then we've looked at what we have for data so far in terms of the number of applications, the number of inquiries, and we're making our best guess about what size first-year class we can bring in next year. We have indirect cost recovery. As you saw in the revenue model, we budgeted about $8.4 million into the revenue side on indirect cost return into our A&G budget. Right? So we could look at changes in that, and we said if we had more grant expenditure activity, we could activate more indirect costs into the A&G budget. And then we have our auxiliary services, and you remember it was a modest-sized piece of the pie, but very much appreciated piece of the pie. From our auxiliary services, which is a separate budget, and again, just to be clear, our auxiliaries refers to dining, room and board, bookstore. Our auxiliary services are profitable, I would say, so they can move over some money into the E&G budget each year. And in FY19, we moved over $3.3 million from auxiliaries into E&G. So we could potentially move some additional funds, and I'll show you the number, we're remodeling out what that would be. And then we have these other expenses. We're calling them flexible expenses because these aren't things we absolutely have to do, at least at this point in time. But we put them on a label, position-related increases. We've made several hires with one-time money. Our enrollments have been very healthy the last 3 years in a row, with record, the last 3 years are the 3 highest in the University of Maine history. We needed to make some hires. We did some of those on one-time money because we wanted to make sure we were going to sustain those levels of enrollment. And some of them came in. We saw the enrollments coming in. We made the decisions later. We have to move those on to base because those, fortunately, we continue to do well with enrollment. We continue to need those positions. We need to move them on to base. But we can make a decision: do we move them on to base all in FY20? Do we do a piece at a time? So we have some discretion over that. We'd like to increase the stipends to graduate teaching assistants to be competitive and bring in very good graduate students and continue to do that. Also to be have the graduate students have a reasonable living wage. Every year we fund a position for a partner accommodation. We make that in addition to the budget. And we have a process for making partner hires. We have acquisitions we do almost routinely every year for the library, but there is some discretion there. Some type years where we've not been able to do that, or we did much less than Joyce had planned for, because we needed to squeeze a little bit more money on that expense side. And then we need to continue to make investments in scholarships and grants. Obviously, this how much tuition and fees we bring in is related to this. We have to be competitive in bringing in new students, and we make decisions about how much money to put into the scholarship pot in order to do that. And we also, of course, have discretionary decision-making authority about how we use those money. How much of that money goes to merit-based scholarship, how much goes to need-based, how much goes in other areas. So now let me show you each quadrant, and I'll put some numbers in there for you. So on the fixed side, we're estimating with the tuition rate increase that we're projecting to bring in nearly $4 million of additional revenue. And again, that's revenue above FY19. With the modest request the system intends to make in the legislature, and a conservative estimate of that, we would get about $400,000 of E&G funds to this campus. So we're anticipating roughly $4.2 million in additional revenue for FY20 above what we brought in FY19. But then, of course, we have the fixed expenses. Looking at our compensation and our contractual agreements, we're again making estimates about where those will come in, and we're estimating that it'll be an additional roughly $4 million toward the expense side on compensation changes. On operational increases, the areas that I talked about, maintenance, shared services, it'll be about $1.8 million for nearly $6 million of additional fixed expenses. Now we go over to the other side, things that we have some flexibility on. We look at tuition and fees. So we model this out. Let me start with tuition. We model this out by saying what size will the first year class be? That's one of the key variables. And I'll tell you the number for here because I think it's important. It's 2,350. For those of you who pay close attention year in, year out, you know that that would be the highest, largest first year class we've ever accepted at University of Maine. 2299 was the next largest. So we are being ambitious in the first year enrollment area, but we think we have good reason to do that. We've got this track record that we built up over the last few years. That's in our favor. We've actually increased our selectivity in growing those numbers, and that makes us more attractive to students. And we have a new Vice President for Enrollment Management, Lizzie Wahab, who's coming with a lot of fresh ideas about how to market, about how to package financial aid. We'll be looking at, we think we can hit that number of 2,350 first-year students. We also, again, make some assumptions about retention, and we're basically use the last 3 years, first year and beyond retention, to estimate where we'll be. Now, we're incrementally increasing the indirect cost recovery by $500,000. If you were paying attention to the earlier pie chart, Claire showed was at $8.4 million of indirect cost return supporting E&G. Under Cody Barolemi's leadership, there's been a great deal of research granting activity over the last couple of years. We've also added significant numbers of faculty, replaced significant numbers of faculty in the last 3 years, where faculty are in their early parts of their career, and not that more senior folks aren't hungry, but they're very hungry to go and get grants and develop their research programs. We've looked at the number of research, the grants that have come in. You get your indirect cost return. You don't get your indirect cost return until you spend the money. So looking at that, trying to make some estimates about what monies will be spent in FY20, we've bumped up incrementally by $500,000 that figure. And in our auxiliary enterprises, as I said, each year we move money over from auxiliaries into E&G. That number was $3.3 million. Worked closely with Dan Sterr, looking at where we're at now, where we anticipate being next year. Again, with healthy enrollments, room and board is up high, bookstore, dining, all those go up. Now there are lots of expenses that go along with that. But Dan's confident that we can increase the amount of money we move over from auxiliaries onto the E&G side. So we raised that. That will be incrementally increased by $300,000. Now, if we look at expenses that we have some discretionary say over. On the position and related increases, most of that money there is moving faculty lines that we first hired on fixed line on the base budget. Then there's some money, as I indicated earlier, for an increase in the rate for graduate teaching assistantships, partner accommodation program, and a few other things. You'll see a big ticket item of increasing scholarships and grants, nearly $4.7 million. We have our flagship match program has been very successful in bringing out-of-state students to the state, and it's very much a net revenue generator for the university. But the expenses have gone up each year, and they will for 4 years as we bring in each of these classes. Next year is the 4th year, so we have to again bump up our scholarship money at a considerable rate. And there are some additional operating expenses that we would like to cover that would go up another $250. So these expenses would be there. Now, to put it all together, I'm going to turn it back over to the president, and she'll put the pieces together for me.
Some of you have been adding up these numbers, I assume. Right? Isn't that what everybody does all the time? And so let's see how this comes out. And before I get there, I should say that I'm very impressed by this commitment to transparency that we have here at the University of Maine. The fact that these presentations are given midstream in a budget development. Remember, I come from the government where there would never be anything remotely like this until it's all done. And so this fact that we're telling you now where it stands as of today, and you know, because Claire showed you, how much more work goes into this, how many more iterations there are, and we're actually going to talk about how everyone in the room can be of help in this process. So I just wanted to say what a terrific process it is. So here you have just a summary again of what the Provost talked about. Our numbers in black, of course, are revenues, the fixed and then the flexible, and then our numbers in red, the expenses, with the negative signs. And here's how it comes out today. And I want you to take a good note. On the top of the slide, it says today's story, as of 11/26/18. We have what we're calling an incremental structural gap, which means that we don't balance yet. But what I understand from the experienced people here is we will balance by the time we get to those final presentations to the board. But here's where we are now, in the middle of our planning, after a tremendous amount of work by Claire and her team and others. When you add together those two numbers, the 10 million in the black, the 11 million in the negative, you get a gap of $1.65 million. And we don't want to be there. But remember, this is today's gap. This is today's discussion, which we're having with all of you. We will be aiming for the balanced budget typical of what we always present. And this is, of course, again, a reminder that this is incremental. So that's where we stand right now. And I want to bring us back to our values because we have many more weeks. I know Claire doesn't think of it as many more weeks, but I do. It's lots of weeks where we will be working across the campus with deans, directors, many of you in the room, to figure out how we get from where we are right now to that balanced budget in a way that preserves our values, which we always have to keep in front of us. So as we think about generating revenue, as we think about careful reductions in particular places, sometimes those are reductions that can be taken care of later in time in different ways. We're always going to be guided to the extent we can be by our commitments to these three areas. And so with that in mind, we're going to share just a little bit of information with you about the flexible side of the budget here. And so this is a reminder, you've seen these numbers already, but on the revenue side, we've got the three categories that you've heard from the Provost, and on the flexible side, we've got three categories. You see how those numbers come out, and I'm going to turn it to Jeff to talk about what we all might be able to do together.
Yeah, so what we wanted to do was just sort of simulate your thinking and have some conversations. Think about, we had there the last slide, $1.6 million number. We need to figure out how to close that. And it's not that complicated. You either bring in more money or you reduce your expenses. So we want to just talk through a little bit about some hypotheticals. One way we look at enrollment. Over the last few years, we really, as I said, we've had great success in increasing our first year enrollment. And I'm quite proud of the way that we've done it. And you know, in these messages, or in these budget presentations, we've talked about enrollment being everybody's job. And I think that message has been heard, and the campus has responded very positively. You see it at open houses, you see it at Accepted Students Days, folks working to help with this process of recruiting. As I indicated, we made, the numbers you saw, we indicated a first-year class of 2350. And again, this is just for hypothetical thinking's sake. We thought, what would it look like if we could change that number? If we could move it up even a little bit further. And so we asked Deb, and then working with Claire, to model that out. If we brought in 50 more first-year students and got to 2,400, the number would look like this. We pretty much, well, we just about cut in half our deficit. Now, you know, you say, well, you know, how do we do that? Are we just going to now let anybody in? That would be a mistake. We move things in the opposite direction here at the university through a variety of ways. In these talks, we've heard to talk about it. We've actually increased. So if you look at the last 3 years, if you use the SAT as just one gross measure of how well prepared students are, the students brought in this fall, on average, had a median SAT score 20 points higher than 3 years earlier than that. We've moved it up each year. I actually think that's part of our success in the enrollments here as well. We've been more successful at attracting higher quality or better prepared students to come to the university. We don't want to change that. But if we could bring in a few more of those, we can get it there. And again, is this number total pipe dream? I'm not sure. We just came to an agreement to do an innovative pilot program with the Naval ROTC national program, where we're going to be bringing in 10 students next fall who are underrepresented minority students who are starting a pre-engineering program. And they'll be funded by us and the Navy for a full ride for a 5-year program. This is the kind of pilot that would change. There's the first 10, and this is the target we've set is 10 for that. There's the first 10 of those students. Lizzie and Marlena and I have been working with and talking with, looking at our international enrollment, and we fortunately have a donor who's very, very interested in this, and we're looking at recruiting students from what's called the United World College. And again, conservatively, we maybe only could get 5 of those students with the help of this donor. But 5 students, there were 15, we're chipping away. So it may not be impossible. It would be ambitious. Earlier this semester, some of you, heard me talking about first-year student success, and we've launched an initiative to improve our first-year student retention. And a lot of that right now this year is planning work. We've been working at it. We formed 9 working groups. There are actually 100 people, around 100 people involved in these. Those working groups will be getting started in a couple of weeks. Now, most of that work is that we're not going to be able to implement until FY20. But I wanted to show hypothetically if we could change our first year retention a little bit. Our first year retention is usually right around 76%. I think that's a 3-year average. 76% would be the average over the past few years. If we could move that to 79%, if we could bump that up 3 percentage points, that would raise about $1 million more. These numbers are incremental, by the way, so it's 804 plus the 1 point something that we get from a 3% increase. And then we would already be into the black. Again, we wanted to talk about this because to get folks thinking, you know, and particularly with respect to retention. We're working hard on that already in terms of the planning book. But in terms of how we've studied retention and looked at all of the varied factors that contribute to retention, they are academic and they are also social, emotional. I think, you know, folks have their mindset on that. We look at, you know, reaching out to a few more students. I think 3% I did in my head is roughly 65 students more to keep into the second year. And we identify, sometimes it doesn't take very much to reach out a hand to a student, to give them that little bit of extra help that might keep them here. And again, I want to show the real impact that could have on our budget. There's also things we can do in the research area, and I'll turn that over to Russell to talk about.
Thanks. And I just want to point out that this focus that we chose on enrollment changes is aligned with fostering learner success. Very interested in the kinds of goals that we have under that particular value to both provide access and inclusion to well-qualified students, to focus on the state of Maine and the kinds of outcomes we need for the state, and to reach greater attainment levels, which would be happening with increased retention. So you've seen these very precise numbers here. Well, all numbers are precise, but you've seen these numbers that go out to lots of significant figures. And now we're going to talk about grant-related changes. The second of our major values is about creating and discovering. That's a critical function of us as a research university. We are about generating new knowledge. Much of that is supported by external funding. And so that's the part that I'm talking about here for people who are engaged in that whole enterprise. And we have the same kind of a what-if scenario with grants. Okay, so we're already 267,000 over over zero, so that we don't have a gap any longer. But we're going to say that there might be some things we could all do together that would help us get even into a safer place and allow us more opportunity to try some other kinds of initiatives. So grant expenditures, if we limit this to the grants that come in with external sponsors as regular grants, essentially, but we can talk in another session if you'd like about the details of how those numbers are discovered. The point of grant expenditures, as the Provost mentioned, is that's about what we actually spend in the given year on our grants. So it's not how big the grant is when it comes in, it's just about how many dollars you actually expend out of that pot. And if we increased our expenditures just by $500,000 in the fiscal year 20, we would be able to change the gap even more, and we'd get up to a very safe cushion of 367. Now, you notice that 500K and the 100K. Those are very round numbers because we don't have the ability yet to model the research spending and the indirect cost recovery in the same way that we can model enrollment. You saw great precision about enrollment, and we have a lot of experience with that. But the estimates that we have is that if we could increase our spending on grants that are in-house now, we would be able to draw in incremental indirect cost recovery that comes off of that spending to the level of $100,000, which would help us further. And the reason I wanted to talk about this example is because this is also something we can work on together. How do you spend more on grants? Well, there are several different things that affect that. One is, for grants that you have in-house, you actually work to stay on timelines, which I know we all do, but I know, at least as a grant getter, I was also very comfortable with those no-cost extensions. It turns out that makes it difficult to plan what our indirect cost recovery will be. Because if we extend for 6 months or for a year, or sometimes you can even go further, then we're not seeing that indirect come in because those dollars aren't getting spent in the years in which we had originally hoped. So that's part of the difficulty in the modeling. So spending down is one thing to do. Of course, getting more grants and getting started on them is another thing to do, and that is something to do in this fiscal year. Particularly because if the grants come in fiscal 19, then the spending begins in fiscal 20, and we're able to see these numbers come up. There are a few other things as well. Grants that have, and this isn't exactly advice to all of us, it's just something to keep in mind. These indirect cost recovery numbers are affected by the indirect cost rate that applies on the particular grant that you get. And sometimes we apply for grants that have very high rates, and then depending on the work, maybe lower rates. Some private sector organizations have very low rates. There used to be a practice, I don't know how much we do of it here, of waiving the indirect costs to try to get into a lower number. I think we probably don't do that too much. In any case, we wanted to bring up one set of ideas from enrollment, because that's about our student success and learner success value, and one set of ideas about grants, because we are about the business of discovery and creation, And there's a place in each of these for people to work together to consider things they might do to help to make changes in these, in the gap. And this is now cumulative, so if we had the change that we could get from this enrollment, plus the change that we would get from increased indirect cost recovery, we would be at 367, and Claire would be much happier, right? Now, getting to this is we're kind of trying this as an experiment, so we'll be interested in your reactions and your thoughts. But this is quite hypothetical, and it's very rough, because there might also be increased expenses with some of this work that aren't necessarily captured here to their full extent, but we tried to estimate. So be aware that we wanted to mostly plant the seed that it's in fiscal 19 right now, where there are some things we all can do together that might help us as we point toward 20. So thanks very much. Please do be in touch with any of us if you have questions and or ideas. We appreciate it. Thank you.